All right, and can everyone see it good? Yes, okay, cool. All right. Okay, sorry, see Jim coming in. All right, well, we can get started now. So as you all know, the topic for today is the Novo classification requests. And I really wanted to dig into this because, first of all, I've never worked on a de novo submission, so I just wanted to really learn more about it. But two, I've been like handling a lot of sales calls lately, and a lot of them with like very innovative sounding technologies. And every time I hear about something that just sounds very novel, I always think like, oh, this might be a de novo. But it's actually not very common to do a de novo submission. So I always really have to stop myself and think like, hey, not everything qualifies as a de novo. So yeah, I just thought we'd use this as an opportunity to refresh our knowledge on them. And also I ran into some interesting facts along the way. So we'll just have a chance to discuss them here. But yep. So with that being said, here's the list of topics for the day. We'll be talking a little bit about the history of de novos. We'll be talking a little bit about what qualifies a device to be able to pursue a de novo pathway. We'll talk about how common they are. We'll talk about some examples. And in the end, we'll discuss a few key differences between de novos and 510Ks. But before that, we're going to have a pop quiz. This will just be a self-test quiz. I think most of the questions are true and false, so maybe you can try what Meri did last time, which is thumbs up for true, thumbs down for false, and then see how we do. But yeah, I think a lot of these are from the article, so hopefully we should all remember the answers. But okay, let me move you all up here. So true or false? De novo devices carry higher risk than 510K devices. I see a laughing emoji.
Risk for whom? The patient or the people regular trying to get him approved?
That's a good question. I meant like as in the classification of medical devices, like risk for patient. Yeah, that's the answer. Okay, sorry, I forgot. What does the laughing emoji mean?
Doesn't
Is
mean
that false?
false. False.
Okay.
False.
Oh yeah, I forgot there was no thumbs down. Okay, thank you. Okay, so yes, false. De novo devices are for low to moderate risk or class 1, class 2 devices, same as 510K. The difference is that de novos are for low and moderate devices that did not exist before, or at least their category of device did not exist before. So I think everyone was pretty good on that one. Okay, next one is historically, de novos have been granted the most for this type of device. Oh, actually, I guess this one, you don't have to laugh or anything. I'll just give you time to think about it. But yeah, this was in the article, and not surprisingly, most de novos so far have been hardware devices, but historically, medical devices have been hardware. But I did want to just bring this question up because it was very interesting to see that roughly half of these devices do have a software component in them. So that was interesting. And I was a little sad to see that only 16% were SAMD, but I would also be very curious to see like the distribution more like in the recent years, not so much historically. Like I wonder if these numbers have shifted in the recent years. I would expect so, but yeah, I have to dedicate more time to see that. All right, next question is true or false? De novos always require clinical data. Okay. So the answer is false. Historically, historically, although most de novos do require clinical data, it's been seen that about 20% of them have not required clinical data. So this means that not all de novos will need clinical data. And on the other hand, some 510Ks will need clinical data. So whether it's a 510K or de novo, that's not really something that would, just right away let you know if clinical data is necessary, which might be a misconception that some of our clients have sometimes. Okay, and I think this is the last question, and it was the most interesting to me, but true or false? If there is no existing product code, it is a de novo. Okay, so the answer is false. There have been some cases where new product codes have been created through 510K submissions. And I think both Meri and George have actually shared examples of these with me. So these are proven. So it's funny because if there's no regulation, then it's a de novo. But no product code doesn't mean that a de novo would be needed. So yeah, very, very interesting fact I recently learned. So yeah. All right, so that's it for the pop quiz. Now we can talk a little bit about the history of de novos. So, and again, a lot of this is coming from the article, but in 1976 was when the Medical Device Amendments to the FD&C Act was introduced and the 510K pathway originated. Since then, the 510K has been the predominant review process, which apparently has accounted for 99% of all device authorizations, which I thought was a huge number. I would have never expected that, but that's what the data says. So that was very interesting to see. And another fun thing to find out is that when the 510K was introduced, it was only 510Ks and PMAs. At the time in 1976, there was no de novo pathway. So if someone wanted to introduce a new device in the market, they had to go the PMA route, even if they were a low or moderate risk device. Then it wasn't until 1997 that de novos were introduced by Congress in the FDA Modernization Act. So I guess almost 30 years later, about 30 years later, was when the FDA introduced the idea of a de novo pathway for devices that did not have a viable predicate, but were not high-risk devices. However, back then in 1997, de novos were only possible if the manufacturer received a non-substantial equivalence letter. This means that they still had to go through the 510K pathway in order to be able to follow a subsequent de novo pathway. So that, yeah, I cannot imagine being a manufacturer back then having to go through that multiple step process. And then it wasn't until 2012 that the FDA Safety and Innovation Act gave authority to FDA to be able to receive direct de novo submissions. So manufacturers no longer had to go through the 510K process first. They could just go directly through the de novo pathway. And this graph coming from the article was very interesting because you can see from 1997 when de novos originated all the way to 2012, like the most there really was 10 de novos per year. And I guess there was a little bit more the year that the act was enforced. But once manufacturers were able to go directly to the de novo pathway, there was a big increase in the number of de novos that were granted. So we can see that manufacturers were somewhat encouraged to just go for the de novo pathway. And then in 2017, we had the first FDA guidance for de novos. So again, there was an uptick in the number of de novos that were granted by FDA. Okay, so now what is a de novo? So a de novo is a regulatory pathway for low to moderate risk medical devices. So high risk devices would go through PMA. One could say that it's an intermediary path between 510Ks and PMAs. But again, it's really just if there's not a substantial equivalent predicate and it's not a high risk device, then you would go for a de novo. A de novo is a classification request for novel devices. So you are you are proposing a classification, but because the FDA is the one accepting it, then you're technically requesting it, whether you're class 1 or class 2. Another good thing to know is that de novos are granted, unlike 510Ks that are cleared and PMAs are approved. The lingo for de novos is granted, and de novos can be used as the first predicate device for future 510(k) submissions. So what qualifies a device to be able to follow a de novo pathway? So first of all, there has to be no existing regulation. It has to be a class 1 or class 2. If it's class 3, then it'd be PMA. There should be no predicate device, because if there is, then you would just do the 510(k). And the manufacturers should sufficiently understand all probable risks, and they need to really know what type of risks are associated with this device in order for them to know whether the general controls alone are enough to mitigate these risks, or we need special controls such as specific testing or labeling in place for these type of devices. So how common are de novos? This data is coming from FDA's Medufa report for the fiscal year of 2023, which is actually not the same numbers you would find if you just went straight to the 510(k) or de novo database. So I'll just put that disclaimer out there. I don't know why the numbers are slightly different, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll just be looking at what the Medufa report says. And at the CDRH office level, so that's the Center of Devices and Radiological Health, in 2023, the office accepted 83 de novo submissions. And on the other hand, they accepted 3,687 510(k) submissions. On the opposite hand, 36 de novos were granted, while 3,078 510(k)s were cleared. So it's like a 1 to 100 ratio for like how many de novos to 510(k)s were in 2023 at the office level. Now, if we wanted to look, I was curious to look more specifically at the radiology division at FDA, just because I thought maybe there'd be a bigger ratio of de novos to 510(k)s, but it was actually quite the opposite. So out of 2 de novos that were granted, 438 510(k)s were cleared. So that's like around 1 to 200. So yeah, very uncommon. It's not very common to have a de novo go through. So that's just something that's good for us to know. And this table is actually from David's article on our website. I really liked it because it shows that there has been an increase in the number of de novos since 2008, while on the 510(k) side, all the years they really stayed at around the 3,000 number. So that's really interesting that we are seeing an increase in the number of de novos. I do wonder if it's going to keep going up, or we're going to reach a threshold one day where like there's just not new device categories, or not as much or not as many. But yeah, I just thought it was a very nice and interesting table. Okay, and now I wanted to talk a little bit about a few de novo examples that I thought were interesting. This one was highlighted in the article, and it's Apple's ECG app. So before the Apple ECG, all the potential ECG devices were for prescription use only, and Apple's ECG app was the first one that was designed to be used over the counter. So no need to have a healthcare professional involved. This was the first of its kind. It created a new product code and a new regulation. And fun fact, it was actually also the fastest de novo that there's ever been. It only took 28 days to review and grant, which is crazy. I don't even know how that's possible. If anyone has any insights on that, I'd be very interested to hear. And even more interestingly, the second fastest de novo is also Apple's irregular rhythm notification feature. So they must have a really good regulatory team or something, but yeah, they've been doing great at de novos. And then the second de novo example I want to talk about is Samsung's sleep apnea feature. So this is another over-the-counter device that uses PPG technology to measure oxygen saturation in the blood and assess the risk of sleep apnea in its users. It was the first product of its kind because the other existing ones are mostly intraoral devices to treat sleep apnea, and also polysomnographs with electroencephalographs to evaluate brain signals during sleep. Wearing a watch and being able to assess the risk of sleep apnea through blood oxygenation was first of its kind. It introduced a new product code, a new regulation, and another fun fact also involving Apple is that I realized that 2 months after Samsung received the Novo grant, Apple submitted their 510(k). So I don't know if like Apple was just like super quick in putting it together or they were both working on it at the same time, but it was just very interesting to see. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is just the key differences between de novos and 510(k)s. So because de novos are for new types of devices, we're not comparing ourselves to anything else, then there's no wording nor no documentation around any basis of substantial equivalence. Instead, you're providing evidence that your device is safe and effective on its own. And some evidence for this includes things like providing a benefit risk analysis to describe how the benefits of using your device outweigh any risks associated with it. We also have to propose whether general controls alone are enough for keeping it safe and effective, or if we need special controls such as specific testing like multiple reader, multiple case studies, standalone performance, or specific labeling information that has to be found in the user manuals. Let's see what else. We also have to provide classification recommendation, whether it's class 1 or 2, and you have to provide evidence that you've done proper research on possible predicates and regulations that your device could fall under, and none of them really are applicable to your device. Something interesting that I saw is that during a de novo review, FDA may actually request a device of your sample in order to examine it and test it. So that was very interesting. Actually, not sure if that's something that they could also do for 510(k)s, but this was my first time seeing this. Other things to consider are that MDUFA fees for de novos are over 6 times more expensive than 510(k)s, so definitely something to consider for our clients. And the de novo review clock with FDA is 150 days, but while the 510(k) one is 90 days. However, on average, the de novo decision times are 2.3 times longer than the 510(k) review time. And yeah, that's it for this presentation. Yeah, I hope everyone found it interesting, but now we'll open it up for discussion.
I had a
wonder if
question.
for, oh,
Sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
I was going to say on Apple's like 28 days and the other one, I wouldn't imagine that they could have had a breakthrough just because it's not for life supporting. But I wonder if they had like a step or something like that, some kind of program that shot them through and they had a lot of assistance along the way during dev or something. I'm not sure. That seems ridiculously fast.
Yeah, it does. Is there like a public database where we could see that?
I don't know if I have to take a look. Yeah, I don't think it would breakthrough. I don't think would make sense, but I wonder if there was some type of a special accelerated program that they somehow got themselves into.
Yeah, I was wondering, is there like third-party reviewers for de novos? Do you know?
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't think so, but I wouldn't think so, but I'm not 100% sure of that. I think that they should not do that,
Yeah,
but I'm not sure.
Yeah,
yeah,
that's
That's
like special
wow.
510K speed.
Yeah, that's incredibly fast.
It's not surprising because I mean, they're a big corporation, so it kind of makes sense, but at the same time, it's way too fast. That's really crazy because the original review time is 150 days, so yeah, less than 30 is just 1/5 of the time.
It's like they were working in cahoots with them, like they must have been some very special situation. Could have been money too, where they somehow.
They
Yeah.
have a special employee named Ben Franklin.
Yeah, yeah, right.
I just had a real quick question. You mentioned that the user fees were like 6 times higher for de
Yes.
novo. Like, is that ratio still the same for small businesses or?
Yeah, that was actually the ratio for small business. I forgot the ratio for the normal fee, but I think for small business, 510Ks are around 6,000 and the Novos are around 40,000. So yeah, it's a substantial payment to make to the FDA. And one thing that is actually in David's article, and I was also discussing with George before, is that when clients submit a de novo, they have no guarantee that they'll be the first de novo to get through the FDA. So, for example, we saw like Apple and Samsung were both working on their sleep apnea devices around the same time. Like if they both submitted a de novo at the same time, whoever gets the de novo first gets granted, and the other one, I think, would just get withdrawn, and they would lose the 40,000 or 100,000+, however it is, with however much it is for non-small businesses. But yeah, that's also something to consider, that these small businesses might be paying 40K and someone could beat them to it and they would just lose the money. But yeah, that's a good question.
On the topic of like the increased fees and like in general the risk that you take as a manufacturer to get something through de novo process, is there like obviously there's like kind of a level of prestige and then also like the biggest thing being first to market if you get de novo. Is there any other like I don't know benefits or like I guess yeah, I'm curious. It just seems like such a large amount of money and time. Like I could also see companies trying to form like consortium groups to try to rather than like a single company take on the risk of submitting. I don't know if that's ever happened.
Yeah, that might be why Apple submitted 2 months later. Like maybe they were talking to each other. I don't know. But my understanding is that de novos are kind of like they have to go through them unless they don't want a certain, like they're okay not having a certain feature. If nothing like that device exists already, then it's just something they have to do. But it was interesting that in that article it did talk about de novos, like it could facilitate the entry to market for future competitors, but as the first to market, you could also set the bar really high. So I guess it really depends on the technology that you're working on. Like if I don't know if it's something really novel. Like I think it had one example, like if you're a big manufacturer and you're working on an AI ML model and you have like a huge data set for training or testing, then you could set that bar high and maybe your competitors would never meet that and you would keep them from coming on. That could be an incentive for some people to go that route, but yeah, I know in the regulatory world we can use words to modify whether it would be a 510K or de novo. But in the ideal world, we would just follow the rules and be like, hey, this technology is a 510K or this one is a de novo, and that's just what we have to do. But yeah, we can certainly play with the words and limit features if needed.
Does the sponsor like dictate a lot of the special controls, or is that dictated by the FDA? Like, could you say that you must train this on at least 10,000 patients or something like that?
I'd be curious that I've never been through a de novo myself, but I would assume that it's something like the pre-submissions, that like you kind of propose something and the FDA is like, no, like we don't think, like I'm sure there's like some educated, evaluations of the numbers. I don't know, like, yeah, I don't know if, because the FDA has a certain threshold. So if you beat it and you go above, would the FDA take that as the rule of thumb? Or would they let the future people to just meet the minimum? I'm not sure. Jim, do you
Yeah.
have it?
Yeah. I did go through a de novo unsuccessfully, but nonetheless learned a lot. Yeah, you propose the sponsor proposes the special controls, and you're exactly right, Meri. Then you just kind of iterate with FDA. But it is to your point, Ethan. It is a good way to try to put a barrier between someone just using, because like with the PMA, you basically have a license with FDA. There can't be someone who comes on the market without doing the same thing. But if you go through the cost of a de novo, and then next person can come right behind you and do a 510K at a much reduced cost after you did all the clinicals, you're going to want to put something in those proposals for the special controls that is a little bit onerous that the other people are going to have to do as well. And FDA more than likely will take it unless it's out of left field. But yeah, it's you propose those. Oh, by the way, it looks like Apple they worked closely with FDA, and it looks like this thing called Digital Health Innovation Action Plan was a pilot program or something. So they worked hand in hand, I guess, with them in some manner to get that. That's absolutely incredible. That's fast.
Yeah, is that plan still, does it look like that's still
It was,
active and
I
available?
don't know, it was put out as a pilot in 2017. Doesn't really, we'll have to look it up maybe because it's for lower risk or things that propose a lower risk than what's on the market. So if you can say that your device does something and it presents a lower risk, it's almost like a step in a way, but yeah, that might be a pathway that we could use to facilitate some speedy. I don't know if it works for 510Ks too. To look that
Yeah.
up. Digital
Yeah,
health.
definitely sounds like something worth looking into.
Mhm.
I once ran into a de novo, and it looked like the purpose of the de novo was to reduce the classification from class 3 to class 2. Is that what all of them are technically doing, or is that a specific case? I thought it sounded kind of unique. This was the de novo that established 892/2090 for CAD-E, CAD-X. And in their decision summary, it says de novo request for evaluation of automatic class 3 designation for the product. Then like the FDA's decision is that this should be class 2. So I don't know if you knew anything about that or if that's how all de novos are worded.
Yeah, I do remember seeing that too when we were working on QClick. I just from me reading the guidance, not having gone through it in practice, I don't think that's how most de novos go. I don't know if there's like another, but you say there's like a DEN number associated to it.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if
Yeah, I guess if you can prove, because you do, like you said before, you do have to have a very good understanding of all the risks that are associated with it. So if you can pose a case that something that they deem class 3 really has a profile that is class 2, it makes sense.
And is it in
Yeah.
the best interest to do that? Like this is assuming you already had like class 3 clearance, or maybe not. I'm not sure. Like would it be in the best interest of a company to take their class 3 device and have it reduced to class 2 so that others could use it as their predicate? I guess then you can develop your own product even further and use your own device as a predicate or something like that.
There's sometimes FDA on their own volition, it's not through de novo, but they look at a regulation and they down classify it. And perhaps, I don't know if that's the way that one worked, perhaps there was an initiative to lower the classification, and then a de novo was what ended up happening to bring the product to market. But it's not the typical, because usually it's a class 1, class 2, low to medium risk device that's the target subject of a de novo.
Yeah, but I think it would make sense to try to down classify a lot of these devices that were cleared prior to the existence of de novos that were just like automatically. But I guess, I don't know what type of devices were like, I don't know if there's just ancient devices that are not even relevant anymore. It'd be interesting to see if, what devices have been down classified.
Yeah, maybe after there's a certain period of time on the market and they have a real good understanding of the actual risks that a potential type of a device poses, and it doesn't meet that stringent class 3 like high risk. If they see that these really aren't as risky, maybe after, I don't know, 5 or 10 years on the market, they might be open to down classifying to with a de novo. It's interesting.
Was there anything that anyone read that they didn't know already, or was everything pretty much just, reinforcing previous knowledge?
I was shocked by the disparity between 510Ks and de novos. I figured there were way more de novos than there are. Because I don't think I understood how broad substantive equivalence is. Like I figured there were probably a lot more things that would be different that would require de novos than 510Ks. So I was shocked by how much 510Ks cover in the regulation field.
Yeah, that was really interesting to me too. Like I really thought there were more de novos out there than they actually are. But I think towards the end of the article, it said something like we shouldn't really compare the number of 510Ks against de novos, because de novos are just a grant for the first device of its kind. So, and then subsequent devices that are the same kind would be 510Ks. So it's kind of like it's kind of weird, but as if we're just comparing how many people go through these processes, then it makes sense. But really, like when we are looking at that device type, there might be one de novo, but there's obviously there could be like 5 or more 510Ks of that same device type. So it'd be interesting also to see like, what those numbers look like how many 510Ks come after the de novo typically. But I also saw that, as maybe we'll see an uptick in de novo to just get more new device types and kind of get away, or like not make the old device types relevant anymore, because as technology is advancing, we're not even using the old device types, and we need new device types to keep the 510K process going. But I also feel like we would run into a limit one day. I mean, I don't know how long that would take, but I guess we'll see.
The bulk of it was new for me because most of my regulatory knowledge stems is like the tangential things that I'll learn while doing my tech OS about 510K specifically. So I didn't have much knowledge about the de novo process or even what de novos were before this. So very much a learning experience for me.
Happy to hear that. Yeah, even like I hear about de novos, but I always thought they were like a much different type of process and submission that you had to make, and then I thought that they were pretty similar just with a few documentation differences. And I think at analytics, we were kind of charging the same for 5TKs and de novos for a little while, but I think recently we've noticed that de novos do require a good amount of extra effort, and we should be probably charging more for them. And I mean, just based on the fact that the Medufa fees are like 6 times higher, and they're covering FDA's time in reviewing these submissions, then does that mean we should be charging 6 times higher for de novos? Could be. But yeah, any final thoughts before we
So
dismiss?
I learned quite a few things in this also, but the thing that stood out to me is looking at the number of de novo requests. I guess the ones that are being granted, and there is an interesting inflection point, like maybe 2012 or 2013, and it just exploded. So I'm really wondering what the underlying cause of that was. Is it difference in regulatory approaches, the actual technological breakthrough that we started, making completely new devices?
Yeah, I think one thing was in 2012, there was a safety act that just allowed manufacturers to go directly to it. So if they thought, oh, we want to do a de novo, we'll apply for a de novo. Because before that, even if they knew their device was a new type of device, they still had to go through the 510K pathway and then go through the de novo. So I don't know if that like was really discouraging, because that's like a total of like 90 plus 150 days. And Jim, do you know how much like a PMA review time is?
No, I don't.
Okay.
Quite long though. I know sometimes they do them in a modular approach where they actually go module by module. So I don't know, couple years or so. I've never been involved with the PMA.
Okay, yeah, just wondering. I don't
Yeah.
really know either, but yeah, 240 days for a device seems quite long, especially if it's low or moderate. I think you would just take out some features and just make it a 510K. Unless it's really worth it.
So were people trying to do like a 510K, and then they would come back and say there's no product code, do de novo, or they would come back and say, hey, this is actual class 3, do a PMA. And maybe we had more PMAs back in the day.
Yeah, it could have been too, yeah, but yeah, they had to go through the 510K. I don't know if like they knew that they were a de novo, but they still had to go through the 510K, or they just didn't really know and they just were like, no, we're not doing the 510K, we'll just go through. I mean, we're not going through PMA, let's just try the 510K and see what happens.
Looks like it takes several years for a PMA process to go through approval.
Wow.
So a lot of money and a lot of time.
Yes.
Yeah, the project I'm working on right now, they're going through a PMA process, and they have the software module as the first module that they're trying to get pushed through. And we were talking about timeline, and yeah, it's going to take them a couple of years to get through the entire suite.
It's nice that they do the modular though, because you think you'd lose track because it's sort of siloed to things, the different biostats and the software. There's different segments that it's good that they look at those, review those individually, and then compile them into the complete PMA. So at least I guess you're making headway as you're going through those years.
Yeah, that's what it sounds like. We get the feedback and then can iterate on it, right? For I think it's like 3 months from the submission to respond and whatnot. So yeah, but it sounded like you could have the hiccups, right? And then kind of like a pile up, if you will, down the process. So yeah, a little bit more care has to be put into it, as I've come to learn.
Yeah, and another data trend I see is the last 2 years, 23 and 24, pretty much doubled from previous years. So I don't know if that's people recovering from the COVID recession or whatever we had, or is this the AI boom that's showing up, or some other breakthrough? And is that trend going to continue?
Yeah.
I don't know if there's an answer. It's just an interesting trend in the data.
Yeah, I think one side of me thinks that with more innovation, we would see more de novos. But at the same time, the other side, I don't know if we're just creating a new set of de novos and then the 510Ks will just explode from those de novos because it's just a new type of technology. But the numbers from that table with all the years, I mean, they keep going up. So I don't see why they couldn't. Yeah, I guess we'll check back in 10 years and see how we did.
Curious for like 510K like resubmissions, if like a newer, if a new module is added to a product that would substantiate like a de novo submission, is that what they do, or do they do a 510K resubmission?
I think if the change that they're making is giving them a new intended use, but then they would be a de novo, but I guess I don't know what type of change
Yeah.
would do that. Yeah, that's an interesting question.
Yeah, it would almost have to change the product code, because if they had a 510K for something that was cleared under a product code, it would almost be like whatever the new functionality would have to cleave a new regulation that didn't exist, that didn't have a precedent.
Actually, I think it could be maybe something like gyricalc. Like, right now they're doing like just brain segmentation and volume quantification, but in the future, if they just change the indications to do autism diagnosis, and I don't know if there's other devices that do that, but let's just pretend that there's not, then just that change in the indications would trigger a de novo if there's nothing like it already. So even though it's the same technology, what you're
right.
intended for is different.
Yeah, you're specifying it to do something that has a clinical correlation, where the other is just a quantitative tool. Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's the path that, if they go that route, that they would have to do, because they couldn't add that indication or intended use on top of what they're doing is just a quantification tool. They have to do it. Yeah, it more than likely would be a de novo.
I think Apple's Watch is actually another example of that, because I was confused at first, because I was like, well, I know, because it was like the first non-prescriptive use, but like I know you can buy, for a long time you've been able to buy over the counter like heart rate monitors and stuff like that. But I think it's because they're non-diagnostic. They're not providing like a AFib detection or anything like that. They're just displaying the waveform. I think when Apple introduced like the subset of features of like detecting and doing analysis on it, that's when it required the separate product code.
Sense, because it detects AFib. Is that the sole? Is that the only arrhythmia that it picks up? It's the only one I know of.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, it makes sense.
By the way, also I was looking up the Apple thing because I was curious, and it looks like they've ended it, but the FDA had this kind of bizarre pilot program they were calling pre-cert, and basically there was like 9 tech companies that, it seems very weird in terms of like so there's some obvious conflicts of interest, but there was like 9 tech companies that basically, like, the proposal was, if you proved that you had like really stringent, quality system, that you followed really good practices and all that, then they would fast track future applications from the company.
Oh, I think you're muted, Jim.
No, now you're muted.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that one ran from 2017 to closed out in 2022 or something. So they must have just slipped in there. There was only 9 of them.
So Josh, are those tech companies pretty big names from what you can see?
Yeah, it's like Apple, Fitbit, Samsung, Google, Johnson and Johnson. It's pretty much who you think it would be.
I
Interesting.
should think something like that was pushed by the companies in congruency with the government, like them coming together to like make sure they can do what they need to do and that they would help them. I think that's more so what that was. Seems like.
Yeah, definitely very interesting finds.
It's always interesting with Apple.
All right. Well, yeah, I think that was a great discussion. If there's not anything else, I think we can have an early dismissal. But yeah, thanks all for attending the session and hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Great topic.
Thanks.
Thanks, Meri.
Thank you.
Yeah, take care.